On a warm spring afternoon, in a city that had seen its fair share of protests, one woman stood at the front of a movement that had grown too large to ignore. Tanya Carter, a woman of strength and determination, knew that this wasn't just another march, it was a moment of reckoning for the system. She wasn't just protesting. Tanya had spent years working in the community, advocating for those who were too often silenced by systems that were supposed to protect them. This march wasn't about just one issue, it was about the hundreds of faces that were forgotten, the people who were ignored, the countless injustices left unchecked. But for Tanya, today would become more than just a protest, it would become the moment her life took a turn she could never have predicted. As the sun set, the march was peaceful. No shouting. No chaos. Just a community coming together, voicing their frustration. But in moments like these, the line between protest and control can quickly blur. A single spark could ignite a fire, and the authorities had no intention of letting this peaceful demonstration last much longer. Tanya knew this feeling all too well. The anxiety that comes with seeing too many officers gather. The familiar sound of boots hitting pavement. She'd seen it before, the subtle shift from protest to confrontation. And yet, she stood tall, unwilling to back down. What she didn't know was that today, the lines would be crossed, and the consequences would follow her for the rest of her life. At first, it seemed like any other protest. But then, they spotted her. Tanya wasn't just any protester, she was a leader, someone who had rallied hundreds of people around a cause bigger than any one individual. And she had made a name for herself. That name, on this day, would become a target. An officer, seeing Tanya in the crowd, immediately signaled to his colleagues. She wasn't just another face, they had been watching her for months. Watching her rise. Watching her speak. Watching her challenge the status quo. They knew she was the one they needed to silence. The crowd started to disperse as the police advanced, but Tanya stayed. Calm. Resolute. She didn't flinch. And that, it seemed, was her mistake. They weren't asking her to leave. They weren't trying to make things easy. No. They were here for her. And as the officers moved toward Tanya, the arrest was imminent. They wouldn't just stop her from speaking, they were about to stop her from doing anything. Tanya Carter, a woman who had spent years fighting for justice, was about to be arrested for doing what she had always done, stand up for what's right. But this wasn't just any arrest. This wasn't the end. No, this was only the beginning. As the cuffs clicked into place, the irony wasn't lost on her. The woman fighting for justice now found herself on the other side of the system, her rights stripped away in front of hundreds of witnesses. And just like that, Tanya was no longer the leader of a movement, she was just another black woman being arrested by a system designed to break her. Her arrest would make headlines. It would fuel the movement even more. But for the officers involved, there was something they didn't know. Tanya was more than just a protester. She was more than just a victim of the system. And soon, the people who sought to break her would learn something they hadn't expected. The wheels of justice may have been turning in the wrong direction that day. But the story of Tanya Carter was just beginning. And the city, for all its secrets, was about to find out something they never saw coming. Tanya Carter wasn't always a symbol of defiance. She wasn't born fighting the system. In fact, like so many others, she was once just a girl trying to find her place in a world that seemed set against her. But her path was different from most. She grew up in the heart of the city, in a neighborhood where dreams often seemed out of reach. It was a place where the rules of the game were rigged before you even got a chance to play. Her mother, a single parent, worked tirelessly, 2, sometimes 3 jobs, just to make ends meet. Her father had long since left, and Tanya had learned early that the world didn't owe her anything. If she wanted something, she would have to fight for it. Yet, Tanya was determined. Her mother's sacrifices fueled something inside of her, a fire that wouldn't be extinguished. She excelled in school, even though she often had to overcome the odds stacked against her. Teachers who didn't believe in her potential. Classmates who treated her like an outsider. But Tanya kept pushing forward, knowing that if she didn't, she would just be another statistic in a system that had no place for people like her. After graduating high school with honors, Tanya was accepted into one of the top universities in the state. It was her ticket out. A chance to prove that anyone, no matter their background, could rise above the circumstances they were born into. But college wasn't the fairy tale she had imagined. It wasn't just about getting an education. It was about constantly proving herself, against professors who dismissed her ideas, against classmates who couldn't see beyond her skin color. And when she graduated, Tanya found herself at a crossroads. She had the degree. She had the drive. But the doors she'd knocked on for months, looking for a job, were mostly slammed in her face. When she did find work, it was at the bottom. A constant reminder that the system had never really changed. It wasn't about being good enough. It was about who you knew. And Tanya knew that the cards were stacked against her. But it wasn't the closed doors that defined Tanya's journey. It was the way she fought back. Her first job was in community organizing. Working with children in underserved areas. Tanya had always felt a pull to help others, to lift them up in ways she never had the chance to be. And that's when she realized that her true purpose wasn't just about fighting for her own success, it was about changing the world around her. Her work in the community caught the eye of others who were tired of watching their neighborhoods crumble under the weight of corruption and injustice. The local police force, the city officials, they all turned a blind eye to the systematic abuse and neglect. But Tanya wasn't one to be ignored. She organized, rallied, and slowly but surely, she began to make waves. And the more she fought, the more people listened. Tanya didn't just want change. She wanted to lead it. She understood the game, the politics of power, and she knew that to truly make an impact, she had to get inside the system that had held her and so many others down. Her transition into politics was no easy feat. Every day was a battle, not just with those in power, but with herself. The doubts. The fears. The moments when she wondered if all the hard work would amount to anything. But there was always something pushing her forward. Always that voice in her head telling her that if she didn't do it, who would? Because for Tanya, success wasn't just about her own achievement. It was about creating opportunities for others. And then came the moment that would change everything. Tanya was offered a seat on a local board, a small, but significant position. It was the opportunity she had been waiting for. It wasn't much, but it was the beginning. She began pushing for changes in city policies, policies that disproportionately targeted Black and brown communities. She worked tirelessly, often late into the night, poring over reports, fighting for justice where it was most needed. And yet, every victory felt like it was one step forward and two steps back. The resistance she faced wasn't just from city officials or police officers, it was from a system that had been entrenched for decades. Every reform, every policy change she advocated for was met with pushback. It was clear that the powers that be didn't want people like Tanya in charge. They didn't want a woman of color, a woman of integrity, shaking up the status quo. Over time, Tanya's work began to attract more attention, both good and bad. The media picked up on her initiatives. Her work, however small the victories, was making waves. The city was noticing her. And so were the people who had worked hard to make sure nothing changed. And that's when she was offered the position of chief of police. At first, it seemed like a joke. Tanya Carter, a woman who had spent years rallying against the very institution she was being asked to lead. But it wasn't a joke. It was an invitation to challenge the system from within. An invitation to lead the very institution that had wronged her, and so many others. She accepted the position. And though many didn't believe she could do it, many didn't believe a Black woman could change an institution like the police, Tanya was determined to prove them wrong. She was determined to show them that the system wasn't beyond repair. That with the right leadership, things could change. But little did Tanya know, the moment she walked into the police department, the moment she took that oath to serve and protect, her life was about to change in ways no one could have predicted. She had no idea that the very same officers who had arrested her, the ones who had mocked her, would be the very ones she would soon command. She was about to step into a battle that would challenge everything she had worked for, her beliefs, her integrity, and her commitment to justice. And the journey she was about to take would change the city, and the people in it, forever. Tanya Carter walked into the police headquarters, a building that had stood as a symbol of authority and power for decades. She was no stranger to the harsh realities of the force, no stranger to the weight of what she was about to take on. But as she stepped through the door, she understood something most people didn't: there was no simple fix. The system was bigger than one person. It had been built on years of tradition, corruption, and an unshakable belief that it was untouchable. Her first day was a whirlwind. Meetings. Briefings. Introductions to officers who barely glanced in her direction, let alone greeted her. Tanya had always known that earning respect wasn't going to be easy. But nothing could have prepared her for the chilling silence that greeted her in the halls. The skepticism. The doubt. The whispers. She was an outsider in a system that valued loyalty to the old ways above all else. And yet, Tanya wasn't just here to be another figurehead. She wasn't here to go along with the status quo. Her vision was clear: reform. She wanted accountability, transparency, and a police force that actually served and protected all citizens. But what she quickly realized was that change wasn't going to come from the top down. It wasn't just about rewriting policies. It was about dismantling an entire culture, a culture that had existed for generations. The first signs of resistance were subtle, almost imperceptible at first. A nod from an officer who refused to meet her eyes. A report that was mysteriously lost. A crucial file that, accidentally, went missing. Tanya soon learned that the systemic struggle wasn't just about loud confrontations. It was about the quiet war being waged behind closed doors, in the halls of power, in backroom deals, and in every corner of the institution she had just entered. Despite the resistance, Tanya pushed forward. She immediately began implementing policies aimed at increasing accountability. Body cameras on all officers. A public-facing database tracking police misconduct. Internal investigations that weren't swayed by favoritism or connections. She even introduced anti-racism training for every member of the force. But for every policy she introduced, for every reform she fought for, there was a voice telling her no. A police union that dug in its heels, claiming her changes were too extreme. Officers who saw her as an enemy, someone who would expose the very things they had worked so hard to keep hidden. What Tanya didn't realize was that her biggest battle wasn't going to be with the criminals on the streets, it was going to be with her own officers. As the weeks turned into months, the cracks in the system started to show. There were murmurs among the rank-and-file officers, some of them openly defiant, refusing to follow the new rules. Others tried to undermine her authority by filing complaints, spreading rumors, and even sabotaging investigations. Despite the chaos, Tanya didn't back down. She met with community leaders, she spoke to activists who had been fighting for change long before she ever thought of running for office. She listened. She understood that her position as chief of police wasn't just about changing policies, it was about rebuilding trust with the very communities that had been betrayed by the system for so long. But the harder she fought for justice, the more isolated she became. The more she demanded accountability, the more allies turned their backs on her. Those who had once praised her for her courage now whispered behind closed doors that she was too radical. Too uncompromising. That she was alienating the people who could make her vision a reality. One evening, Tanya received a message that would change everything. A whistleblower from within the department had reached out. They claimed that several high-ranking officers were involved in illegal activities, drug trafficking, money laundering, even orchestrating false arrests to silence those who opposed them. The very people she had once trusted were now revealed to be part of the corruption she was trying to dismantle. Tanya was faced with a decision that no one should ever have to make. Would she expose the corruption, risking her own career and safety in the process? Or would she turn a blind eye to the very things she had sworn to protect her city from? The weight of the decision was suffocating. She chose to expose it. Armed with the evidence, Tanya went public, unveiling the deep-rooted corruption within her own department. The fallout was immediate. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, the entire city was in an uproar. Officers who had once followed her were now turning against her. The police union threatened legal action, accusing her of violating the officers' rights. And her own allies, those who had once praised her courage, now distanced themselves, too afraid of the backlash to stand by her side. The fallout was swift and brutal. But in that moment, Tanya knew she had made the right choice. She had chosen the truth over loyalty. She had chosen justice over corruption. And now, there was no turning back. Every move she made from this point forward would be scrutinized. Every decision would be questioned. And the system that had tried to break her, tried to crush her, would soon find itself facing a force unlike any it had ever encountered. Tanya Carter was no longer just a chief of police, she was a symbol of resistance. A symbol of hope. But the question remained, would she survive the storm she had unleashed? Once the corruption had been exposed, Tanya Carter's life would never be the same. What had started as a fight for justice was now a battle for her survival. A battle against a system that had been entrenched for so long, no one, not even her, could predict the consequences. At first, it seemed like the city was divided. On one side, there were those who stood with her, the activists, the community leaders, the families who had long suffered under a corrupt police force. For them, Tanya was a beacon of hope. A hero who had dared to expose the truth, no matter the cost. But for others, those entrenched in the old ways, Tanya was now the enemy. The officers who had sworn an oath to serve and protect began to question her authority. The union, which had once been her ally, now turned its back on her. They saw her as a threat to everything they had worked for. Their grip on the department, their ability to maintain power and control, was slipping, and they weren't about to let a woman, let alone a black woman, tear it all down. Days after the whistleblower's revelations went public, Tanya was faced with an onslaught of attacks. Legal challenges. Public condemnation. The media, once heralding her as a trailblazer, now turned on her, questioning her leadership. Had she gone too far, they asked. Was she just another political pawn, looking to score points at the expense of the men and women in uniform? The pressure was mounting, and Tanya could feel the walls closing in. Within the department, it was clear, there was no going back. Officers began pulling back, refusing to cooperate with her reforms. Investigations stalled. Files went missing. Vital evidence was conveniently overlooked. Every step forward was met with another obstacle. Tanya had been given a seat at the table, but now she was fighting to even hold her ground. At home, the weight of the battle began to take its toll on Tanya's personal life. Her family, her friends, people who had supported her vision, now found themselves caught in the crossfire. There were threats. Anonymous calls. Disturbing messages on social media. But it wasn't just the outside world that was turning against her. Tanya herself began to question her decisions. Was it worth it? Was her pursuit of justice worth the price she was paying? There were nights when she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the world pressing down on her. The fear wasn't just for herself. It was for the people she had promised to protect. She had exposed the system, but now the system was fighting back with everything it had. And in the midst of it all, she was losing allies, some of the very people who had helped her get to where she was now. Then came the bombshell. A leaked document. A file that detailed Tanya's own past. A string of allegations from her time as a community organizer. Claims that she had once been involved in civil disobedience, protests that had gotten violent. Rumors of an arrest record from years before. The media seized on it like sharks to blood. Was Tanya Carter hiding her own past, they asked. Could she really be trusted to lead a police department when her own history was filled with defiance against the law? Suddenly, Tanya was no longer the reformer. She was the hypocrite. The public began to question her credibility. The very thing that had made her stand out, her unwavering commitment to social justice, was now being twisted against her. She was portrayed as a radical, someone with too many skeletons in her closet to lead a department that had already been accused of corruption for years. But Tanya wasn't one to give up so easily. She knew the system had one last weapon to wield against her, her past. And she wasn't about to let it be the thing that took her down. She refused to back down, even when it felt like the walls were closing in. She issued a public statement, owning her past, but also reaffirming her commitment to change. "I've fought for justice my entire life," she said. "And I will continue to fight. The truth is hard to swallow, but it's the truth we need." And then, just when it seemed like her career was finished, something unexpected happened. A shift in the public narrative. The same people who had once criticized her now began to rally behind her. The community, the activists, the families who had been waiting for change, they stood up for Tanya. They took to the streets, demanding that the corruption be rooted out, that the department be held accountable. For the first time in weeks, Tanya felt a sense of hope. The city was waking up. People were beginning to understand that her fight wasn't just about her, it was about them. It was about a system that had hurt them for far too long. The momentum she had started building, the revolution that had been sparked by her courage, was now too powerful to stop. As the days passed, the pressure didn't ease. In fact, it intensified. But now, Tanya was no longer alone in her fight. She had the people behind her. And though there were still many who sought to tear her down, the forces of change had already started to gain unstoppable traction. The corrupt officers, those who had tried to bury her, found themselves exposed. Whistleblowers came forward, corroborating the stories, revealing more layers of the conspiracy. And slowly, the walls began to crumble. Tanya Carter wasn't just fighting for her job anymore. She was fighting for the future of the city. And the question now was no longer whether she would survive the storm, but whether the system would survive her. As the days turned into weeks, Tanya Carter found herself standing at the crossroads of her career, and possibly her life. The battle she had started, the one that had consumed her body, her mind, her soul, was no longer just about changing a corrupt police department. It was about uncovering a truth so buried, so entrenched, that it threatened to undo everything she had fought for. Tanya had spent months investigating the department, working tirelessly to root out the corruption that had festered for years. She had gathered files, interviewed whistleblowers, exposed secrets that many thought would remain hidden forever. But even as the media covered the fallout, even as the city seemed to rally behind her, Tanya knew there was something deeper. Something more. A hidden truth that, if brought to light, would change everything, everything she thought she knew about her city, her department, and even herself. Late one night, after hours of poring over stacks of evidence, Tanya received an encrypted email from an anonymous source. The message was short, but the implications were enough to send a chill down her spine. It contained a series of documents, confidential memos, police reports, financial records. It was more than she had ever anticipated. The documents revealed a dark, hidden partnership between the police department's top brass and a powerful criminal organization that had been operating right under the city's nose for decades. Tanya had always known that corruption ran deep, but this was on another level. The documents traced the money laundering schemes, the organized crime connections, the protection rackets that had funded both the police union and the political elite. The deeper she dug, the more she realized that the very officers she had been fighting alongside were complicit in one of the largest criminal operations in the state. But it didn't stop there. The files contained something far more explosive, a list of names, including politicians, city council members, and even some of the wealthiest businessmen in the area. These weren't just names of people under suspicion, they were people who had knowingly used the police force to protect their own interests, to crush any opposition, to destroy lives without consequence. For years, the police had not just been enforcing the law, they had been the enforcers of a criminal empire that extended beyond the department and into the very fabric of the city. And that's when Tanya found it. The file contained a memo detailing a plan to discredit and ultimately remove her from her position. The memo wasn't just a smear campaign, it was a coordinated effort, a calculated move orchestrated by the very people who had once given her the power to change the department. They knew she was a threat, and they had been setting the stage for her downfall since the moment she had taken office. Tanya was no longer just up against a corrupt department. She was up against a network of power so vast, so entrenched, that it had poisoned every corner of the city. She had become the enemy of an empire. And now, they were ready to crush her. The battle she had started was about to escalate into something far more dangerous. Her heart raced as she read the names on the list, familiar faces, people she had trusted, worked with, and fought alongside. The betrayal was personal now. But Tanya wasn't someone who would be intimidated. The revelation wasn't just a warning, it was a call to action. This wasn't just about exposing the bad apples in the police force anymore. This was about exposing a corrupt, broken system that had destroyed lives, manipulated power, and poisoned the very heart of her city. The decision was now clear, Tanya had to go public. She couldn't keep this to herself. If she did, the system would continue to thrive in the shadows, undisturbed, and she would be silenced. But going public meant opening herself up to even more threats, more attacks. She would be risking everything, her job, her reputation, and even her life. But Tanya had come too far to back down now. She gathered her most trusted allies, community activists, legal experts, and a small group of officers who still believed in her vision, and prepared to release the documents to the public. It was time to expose the full extent of the corruption, to show the city just how deeply the rot ran. As Tanya sat down at her desk, staring at the files in front of her, she knew this was the moment that would define her. She wasn't just fighting for a department anymore. She was fighting for the future of the city she had sworn to protect. With trembling hands, she hit send, and the documents, along with a statement detailing the full extent of the corruption, were sent to every major news outlet in the city. The storm she had unleashed now reached a new, unthinkable level. Within hours, the city was in an uproar. The revelations were too much to ignore. The connections to organized crime. The cover-ups. The manipulation of the justice system. The people who had once controlled the narrative, the police, the politicians, the businessmen, were now the ones being exposed. And Tanya? She had just set the stage for a reckoning. But the question remained, would this be the turning point the city needed? Or would the forces that had held power for so long crush Tanya before she had a chance to change anything? The storm that Tanya Carter had unleashed had arrived. Within hours of releasing the explosive files, the city erupted in chaos. News outlets scrambled to cover the revelations. Social media exploded with reactions, outrage, disbelief, and for many, a sense of vindication. The corruption, once carefully hidden behind closed doors, was now splashed across every headline. The people, the very ones who had suffered under the oppressive system, finally had the truth in their hands. At first, there was silence. The world outside her office seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Tanya sat at her desk, surrounded by the documents, the names, the undeniable evidence. She knew the storm had only just begun, but there was no turning back now. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, messages from allies, family, even critics. They all wanted answers. But it was the sound of the sirens, the rumble of police cars outside her building, that told her everything she needed to know. The system wasn't going to go down without a fight. The police chief, who had once been her ally, issued a public statement within hours, calling the allegations false and accusing Tanya of being part of a political smear campaign. The mayor, who had tried to remain neutral, was now forced to take sides. The pressure mounted on him to either defend Tanya and her revelations or disavow her completely. The stakes were sky high, with every corner of the city watching, waiting for a sign of weakness. And then came the threats. Not just against her career, but against her life. Tanya received word that the criminal organization linked to the corruption had made their move. Her name appeared on a list, targets to be eliminated. She had expected it, but that didn't make the fear any less real. The threats became more direct. A black SUV appeared outside her home. Shadowy figures were spotted near her office. And yet, Tanya did not back down. Her resolve had hardened. She had faced the worst of the system before, now, it was time to face it head-on. The district attorney's office, spurred by the public outcry, launched an official investigation. But it wasn't just the local authorities who took notice. The FBI, too, got involved. The depth of the corruption in the police department, intertwined with criminal syndicates and influential figures, had attracted the attention of federal agents. The city's politicians, once thought untouchable, now found themselves under scrutiny. Slowly, the network that had held the city in its grip began to unravel. But even as the investigation gained momentum, there were those who tried to suppress it. People within the system still held power, powerful politicians, business elites, and yes, even cops who hadn't been caught yet. They worked tirelessly behind the scenes, trying to shift the narrative, launching smear campaigns against Tanya, discrediting the evidence. The war for truth raged on. But Tanya was relentless. With the public behind her, she held her ground. She appeared at rallies, addressed the people, and reassured them that no matter how hard they fought to bury the truth, she would never back down. It wasn't long before the first arrest was made. A senior officer in the department, caught on tape accepting bribes from organized crime figures. Then, more followed. One by one, the corrupt officers were taken into custody. The names on the leaked documents matched. The scandal had reached its breaking point. The criminal empire embedded within the department had no place left to hide. As more arrests were made, the city's distrust of the system began to shift toward a sense of justice. For the first time in years, it felt as though the balance was starting to tip in favor of the people. Community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens who had long felt voiceless found themselves empowered. They rallied, protested, and demanded the release of more information, more accountability. The media coverage, once critical of Tanya, now turned in her favor. She was right, the headlines began to say. She was the truth-teller this city needed. And then came the day when the biggest blow to the corrupt network was struck. The mayor, under intense pressure from the public and the media, was forced to resign. The FBI had uncovered not only his connections to the criminal syndicates but also his direct involvement in obstructing justice during Tanya's investigation. As he was led out of City Hall in handcuffs, the reality set in for the people of the city. The system, the one that had protected those in power for so long, was finally being torn down. Tanya Carter had done the impossible. Not only had she survived the storm, but she had also led the charge that dismantled the very system that had tried to destroy her. The streets that had once been filled with protests against her were now filled with celebrations. The people, the ones she had fought for, stood beside her, acknowledging the victory they had achieved together. The police department, once an institution of fear and corruption, began to reform from the inside out. Tanya Carter became the symbol of a new era, a new hope for justice, transparency, and accountability. She had taken on the very heart of the system and won, not through force, but through sheer will and an unwavering belief in the truth. As the city moved forward, Tanya knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be more battles to be fought. But she had made a difference. She had shown the world that even when the system is stacked against you, change is possible. And as long as there were people like her, people who refused to stay silent, justice would always have a chance. Tanya Carter had not only taken down a corrupt system, she had inspired a revolution. And that revolution, one driven by truth and justice, would continue to echo through the streets of the city for years to come. Her victory was not just hers alone. It was the victory of everyone who had ever stood up for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And as Tanya stood at the podium that day, delivering a speech to a crowd that now saw her not as a threat, but as a leader, she knew that she had truly changed the city, and the course of history.